The air in the sterile white room was a thief. It stole warmth, scent, and identity, leaving behind only the clinical chill of recycled oxygen and the faint antiseptic tang of compliance. Elian stood on the polished concrete dais, a single specimen under the flat, unforgiving glare of recessed lighting. He was not a person. He was collateral. The thin, disposable tunic they had given him did nothing to ward off the cold that seeped from the floor into the soles of his feet, a cold that felt ancient and absolute. He kept his gaze fixed on a point on the far wall where the white paint met the white molding, a seamless, featureless horizon. To look down was to see the observers behind the one-way chromaglass. To look up was to surrender to the cameras hidden in the ceiling. So he looked forward, into the blank, perfect nothing. He breathed in, a slow, measured drag of air that did not fill his lungs. He breathed out, a ghost of vapor in the refrigerated atmosphere. This was the final stage of the transaction, the culmination of his brother's desperate gambles and his own ruinous love. Reese's face swam in his memory, pale and slick with the sweat of sheer terror. The broken data slate in his hand, the figures glowing a ruinous, predatory red. "They'll take everything, Ilian," he'd whispered, his voice cracking, the sound of a man splintering from the inside out. My research, my life. And Elian, who had shielded Reese from every playground bully and every academic rival, had done the only thing he could. He had found the one asset he had left to liquidate: himself. The process had been brutally efficient. A clinical evaluation, a biometric cataloging, a designation. Asset 734, Omega class, prime condition, unbonded. His scent, normally a soft, subtle blend of rainwash stone and wild honey, had been neutralized by suppressants, scrubbed from his skin until he smelled of nothing but the facility's sterile soap. They did not want a person. They wanted a canvas, a blank slate upon which the buyer could project his desires. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a debt, made flesh. A soft chime echoed in the room, almost too gentle for the gravity of the moment. It was starting. Through the chromaglass, he could not see faces, only the vague, shifting silhouettes of immense wealth. They were sharks in a placid, bloodless aquarium sensing the offering. A synthesized voice, smooth and devoid of any human inflection, began the recitation. Asset 734, Omega male, age 24 standard years, genetically confirmed recessive markers for high fertility, unclaimed, unbonded. Biometric profile available upon request. Bidding will commence at 500,000 credits. The number was staggering, enough to erase Reese's debt 10 times over. But this was not about the debt anymore. This was about ownership. The voice was a metronome, counting down the seconds of his freedom. Elian focused on his breathing, on the point where the white walls met. He imagined himself dissolving into that line, becoming as featureless and empty as the room. A phantom, untouchable. The bids began as a flurry of electronic signals, unseen and unheard by him. The synthesized voice was the only arbiter, its tone unchanging as the price for his life escalated. 550,000, 600,000, 625. Each announcement was a hammer blow against the fragile shell of his composure. He felt a tremor begin in his knees and willed it to stop, locking them until the muscles ached. He would not tremble. He would not weep. He would not give them the satisfaction of his fear. He had made this choice. He would stand by it, a statue carved from shame and resolve. The price climbed, a ladder to a heaven he would never see. 1,000,000 credits. 1.2 million. The numbers became abstract, meaningless. They were no longer about his brother's salvation. They were a measure of his own gilded cage. Then, a change. A subtle shift in the sterile air. A scent, sharp and clean, cut through the antiseptic fog. It was ozone after a lightning strike, the cold, hard scent of granite, and something else, something deeper and more complex, the metallic tang of immense, contained power. It was an alpha's scent, but not the musky, aggressive kind that prowled the lower city districts. This was different. It was controlled, precise, and utterly overwhelming. It felt like a physical presence in the room, a pressure against his skin. The synthesized voice paused for a fraction of a second, the only sign of a disruption in its programming. A floor bid has been entered. 5 million credits. A collective stillness seemed to fall over the unseen observers. The rapid-fire bidding ceased. 5 million. The number hung in the air, an impossible weight. It was not a bid. It was a declaration. It was an execution. Elian's gaze finally broke from the wall. He couldn't help it. He scanned the dark glass, searching for the source of that scent, of that impossible power. He saw nothing but his own reflection, a pale, hollowed-out figure in a white tunic. Who would pay such a price? What kind of man commanded that kind of wealth and wielded that kind of presence? The fear he had so carefully suppressed began to rise, cold and sharp as bile. This was not a simple transaction. This was something else entirely. The voice spoke again, its synthesized calm, a mockery of the turmoil in the room. 5 million credits going once? Silence. The ozone scent intensified, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Going twice. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He was no longer just sold. He was claimed, possessed. The finality of it was absolute. Sold, the voice declared, followed by the soft, sharp sound of a digital gavel. To the sovereign. The scent in the room crested, a wave of cold stone and lightning that washed over him, and for the first time since he had walked into this place, Elian felt the true, bone-deep terror of being owned. The white walls of his featureless world began to close in. The transition from object to property was seamless and chillingly impersonal. Two attendants, their faces obscured by reflective visors, entered the room. They moved with a practiced efficiency that spoke of countless similar acquisitions. They did not speak to him. They did not look at him, not as a person. They flanked him, their presence a silent instruction. Elian followed, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. He was led through a series of corridors, each one as white and sterile as the last, a labyrinth designed to disorient and dehumanize. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control systems and the soft slide of automated doors. The scent of the Alpha, his new owner, lingered in the air, a ghost that walked beside him, a constant reminder of the invisible chain now fastened to his soul. It was not a scent of passion or lust. It was the scent of authority, of absolute, unquestionable control. It promised not violence, but a chilling, placid order from which there would be no escape. He was brought to a small, windowless chamber, furnished with a single chrome chair and a table. On the table lay a data slate and a biometric stylus. One of the attendants gestured toward it. "Finalize the transfer," a filtered voice instructed from a speaker in the attendant's helmet. Elian's hand trembled as he picked up the stylus. The screen glowed to life, displaying the contract. It was dense with legal jargon, clauses of ownership, and waivers of personal autonomy. He scrolled through the pages, his eyes catching on phrases that made his stomach clench. Perpetual ownership, surrender of all personal rights, absolute compliance. At the bottom, a line blinked, waiting for his signature. Below it, the buyer's designation was listed simply as Kalen Rael, acting representative of the Sovereign Consortium. The name meant nothing and everything. It was the signature on the deed to his life. He pressed his thumb to the scanner, then signed his name. The ink felt like blood. With a soft chime, the screen flashed. Transfer complete. Asset 734 is now the legal property of the Sovereign Consortium. He was no longer Elian. He was Asset 734. The attendants led him away again, down another corridor to a private exit. A sleek black ground car, its windows tinted to an opaque obsidian, waited in a subterranean bay. The door hissed open, revealing an interior of cool grey leather and polished chrome. Sitting inside, shrouded in the vehicle's dim light, was the Alpha. Elian froze. The scent was overwhelming now, a physical force that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Ozone, granite, and the clean, sharp edge of winter. The man was dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal grey that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was the colour of dark silver, swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and severe, aristocratic beauty. But it was his eyes that held Elian captive. They were the colour of a stormy sea, intelligent, calculating, and utterly unreadable. There was no heat in them, no predatory gleam. There was only a profound, unnerving stillness. He was not looking at Elian as an object of desire. He was looking at him as one might study a complex equation with a detached, analytical curiosity. "Get in," the Alpha, Kalen, said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and measured, a perfect match for his scent. It was not a request. Elian obeyed, sliding onto the leather seat opposite him. The door hissed shut, sealing them in a capsule of silence and tension. The car began to move, gliding through the tunnels beneath the city with a silent, electric grace. Elian kept his eyes downcast, fixed on his own hands, which he had clasped tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. He could feel the Alpha's gaze on him, a weight as tangible as a hand. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Elian had prepared himself for a monster, for a brute who would gloat and threaten and lay out the cruel terms of his servitude. He had not been prepared for this cold, formal distance. It was a different kind of terror, the fear of the unknown, of a power so vast it did not need to announce itself with aggression. "The debt owed by your brother, Rhys Amarel, has been settled," Kalen said finally, his voice cutting through the silence. "The lender, Silas Vaughan, has been compensated in full. All liens against your brother's research and personal assets have been released." Elian's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected to be told. He had assumed the details of his sacrifice would be beneath his owner's notice. "Rhys, he is safe?" The words came out as a choked whisper. Kalen gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "He is. The transaction is complete. He will not be troubled by that party again." A wave of relief so profound it was painful washed over Elian. It was done. Rhys was safe. The price had been paid. The relief was immediately followed by a fresh spike of dread. The debt to Silas was gone, but a new, infinitely larger one had just been created. He now belonged to the man sitting across from him. What? What do you require of me? Elian forced himself to ask, his voice barely audible. He needed to know. He needed to understand the shape of his cage. Kaelin's storm-grey eyes met his, and for a moment, Elian saw something flicker in their depths, something that was not calculation, but it was too fleeting to name. For now, Kaelin said, his voice as cool and smooth as polished stone. You require rest. The suppressants you were given will wear off shortly. The side effects can be disorienting. He said nothing more. He simply turned his gaze to the window, watching the blurs of light as the car ascended into the glittering heart of the upper city. Elian was left in silence, his mind reeling. Rest, disorienting side effects. It was so clinical, so considerate. It was wrong, all wrong. He was property, an asset purchased for an exorbitant sum. There should be demands, commands, a list of duties and expectations. There should be a collar, real or metaphorical. But there was only this unnerving, placid silence and the cold, clean scent of a storm that refused to break. The car continued its silent climb, rising higher and higher into the sky, and Elian felt as though he were ascending to a pristine, sterile heaven that was, in reality, the most exquisite hell he could have ever imagined. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement of absolute control. It occupied the entire top floor of the city's tallest spire, a circular space encased in floor-to-ceiling smart glass that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. The city lights glittered like a fallen galaxy, a universe of lives he was no longer a part of. The decor was brutally minimalist. Floors of polished white marble bled into walls of the same material, furnished with sparse, angular pieces in shades of charcoal and chrome. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. Not a single object seemed out of place. It was a sterile, architectural masterpiece, as beautiful and as lifeless as a tomb. The air itself was different here, filtered and cool, carrying only the faint, pervasive scent of Kaelin's ozone and granite. It was his territory, and Elian was the only foreign object within it. Kaelin led him into the vast, open-plan living area. The silence was immense, broken only by the soft whisper of their footsteps on the marble. Elian felt exposed, a single, flawed specimen in a perfect, sterile exhibit. He kept his arms wrapped around himself, the thin tunic a pathetic defense against the sheer scale of the space and the invisible weight of its owner's presence. "Your room is this way," Kaelin stated, not looking back to see if Elian was following. He moved with an economy of motion, a predator's grace that was all the more intimidating for its restraint. He led Elian down a long, white hallway where the walls seemed to absorb all sound. He stopped before a seamless panel that slid open at his approach. The room beyond was as large as Elian's entire former apartment. It mirrored the rest of the penthouse's aesthetic. White marble, grey furnishings, a wall of glass overlooking the city. A large, low bed was dressed in crisp grey linens. The only hint of anything personal was a single, perfect white orchid in a simple black vase on a bedside table. "The closet is programmed with basic apparel in your size. The sonic cleanser is through that door," Kaelin said, his tone that of a concierge outlining amenities. "A nutritional synthesizer is integrated into the wall. It has been calibrated to your dietary needs. You may request specific items if you wish." He spoke of needs, of apparel, of nutrition. He did not speak of duties, of expectations, of the true nature of their relationship. The dissonance was making Elian's head spin. He was a prisoner, being given a tour of his luxurious cell. "What are your rules?" Elian asked, the words feeling rough and clumsy in the pristine silence. He had to know. The uncertainty was a worse torment than any command. Kalen turned to face him fully. In the soft, indirect light of the hallway, his silver hair seemed to gleam, and his grey eyes were deep, shadowed pools. "My rules are simple," he said, his voice low and even. "You will not attempt to harm yourself. You will not attempt to harm me. You will not attempt to leave the secure floors of this building. Beyond that, you may do as you please." Elian stared at him, uncomprehending. "As I please." The concept was absurd. He was property. His pleasure was irrelevant. "What do you want from me?" he repeated, a desperate edge creeping into his voice. He needed the script, the role he was meant to play. Was he a companion, a servant, a bedwarmer? The not knowing was a form of madness. Kalen's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of something. Was it frustration? Weariness crossed his features. "I have already told you. For now, I want you to rest. The suppressants are beginning to fail. Your system will be in flux. It is better to manage that in a controlled environment." He gestured vaguely to Elian's neck, where a faint, tingling numbness was beginning to spread from the injection site. The scent neutralizer was wearing off. Soon, his own Omega scent would return, flooding his senses, making him vulnerable. It was a biological reality he couldn't escape. Kalen's clinical foresight was both a kindness and a terrifying display of his knowledge, of his control. "The door will not be locked," Kalen added, as if it were an afterthought. "You are free to explore the main living areas. My office and personal quarters on the upper level are private. Do you understand?" Elian could only manage a numb nod. Free to explore. The door will not be locked. It was a lie. The entire building was a lock. His new legal status was a lock. Kalen's very presence was a lock. The freedom was an illusion, a cruel piece of psychological theater. Kalen seemed to accept his silent acquiescence. He turned and walked away down the hall, his footsteps silent on the marble, leaving Elian standing alone in the doorway of his new cage. Elian stepped inside, and the panel slid shut behind him with a soft, definitive hiss. He was alone. He walked to the vast window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. The city sprawled below him, a breathtaking tapestry of light and life. He was closer to the stars than he had ever been, and yet he had never felt so far from them. He was a ghost in a palace in the sky, owned by a man who wanted nothing from him but his presence. The sheer maddening pointlessness of it was the cruelest chain of all. As the first faint, familiar traces of his own scent, rain and honey, began to bloom in the sterile air, a single hot tear traced a path down his cold cheek. It was the only thing in this perfect, empty room that was truly his. From the upper-level observation deck, a mezzanine that overlooked the main living area, Kalen watched the Omega. He stood motionless in the shadows, a ghost in his own home, observing the asset he had acquired. Asset 734, Elian. The name felt foreign on his internal tongue. He had made a point of learning it, just as he had learned the details of the brother's debt, the name of the lender, and the precise nature of the research that had been threatened. Details were paramount. Control was in the details. He watched as Elian stood at the window, a fragile silhouette against the city's electric glow. He saw the tension in the boy's shoulders, the way he hugged himself
as if to keep from shattering. He saw the single tear that traced a path of defiance on his cheek. It was this, the defiance, that had drawn his attention at the auction. He had not gone to the flesh market seeking an Omega. He despised the place, a gilded monument to the very system he was forced to navigate, the system that had built his family's fortune. It was a marketplace where living beings with thoughts and histories and fears were stripped of their names and sold like stock options. He had gone to observe, to gather data on a rival consortium's activities. But then, Asset 734 had been brought out. There was a stillness about him, a refusal to crumble under the weight of the collective gaze of his observers. While other offerings trembled, or wept, or adopted a hollow-eyed submission, this Omega had simply stood there, his gaze fixed on nothing, his body rigid, with a pride that had no right to exist in a place like that. It was in his file. He had sold himself. It was not a capture, not a punishment. It was a choice, a terrible, desperate choice, but a choice nonetheless. And in that choice, Kalen saw a reflection of his own constrained existence. He too was a product of his station, his life a series of strategic decisions made within a gilded cage. He had placed the bid on impulse, a sudden, cold surge of something. It wasn't desire. He felt the biological pull of the Omega's nascent scent, a faint whisper of honey and rain beneath the chemical suppressants. But it was a distant, clinical observation. It was not lust that had driven him to utter a number that stunned the room into silence. It was a strategic move, executed with the same precision he would use to acquire a controlling interest in a rival corporation. He was acquiring a problem to solve it. The problem was Silas Vaughn, a bottom-feeding predator who preyed on the desperate, and the system that allowed men like him to flourish. By acquiring the debt and the collateral, he could excise Vaughn from the equation cleanly and permanently. It was an act of order, not of passion. And yet, as he watched the Omega, alien in his home, he was forced to confront the untidy variable he had introduced into his meticulously controlled life. Alien was not a data point. He was a living, breathing being, radiating a palpable aura of fear, confusion, and wounded pride. Kalen had anticipated the fear. He had not anticipated the way it would manifest as a silent, challenging stillness that pricked at the edges of his own disciplined composure. He had given the Omega a room, sustenance, and a set of simple, non-threatening rules. He had expected compliance, a gradual settling into a new reality. He did not expect the direct, desperate question, "What do you want from me?" The boy was trying to understand the terms of his servitude, and Kalen had no terms to give him, because he did not want a servant. He did not want a pet. He did not want a lover. He had purchased Elian for the same reason a man might purchase a rare caged bird, not to hear it sing, but to have the power to open the cage door. But the door could not be opened yet. The world outside this spire was not safe for an unbonded, high-value Omega who had just been publicly sold. Vaughn's associates, the rivals he had outbid, the vultures who circled the lives of the wealthy, they would all see Elian as a vulnerability, a pawn to be used against him. To release him now would be to condemn him. So, for now, the cage must remain. A comfortable cage, a safe cage, but a cage nonetheless. This was the part he had not fully calculated, the human element, the quiet suffering of the boy by the window. He felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his chest. It was the ghost of an old failure, a memory of another person the system had broken,
someone he had failed to protect. He would not fail again. He would keep Elian here, in this sterile sanctuary, until he could neutralize all external threats. He would treat him with a cold, detached respect. He would be a warden, not a master. It was the only way he knew how to operate. He turned from the observation deck. The image of the solitary figure against the glass burned into his mind. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a responsibility. And Kalin Rael did not fail his responsibilities. Days bled into one another in a seamless, sterile procession. Elian existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the opulent, empty spaces of the penthouse. The suppressants wore off completely on the second day, and his own scent returned with a vengeance. The sudden rush of his own biology was dizzying, a flood of heightened senses and emotional vulnerability that left him feeling raw and exposed. The scent of rain-washed stone and wild honey seemed to fill every room he entered, a stark, organic contrast to the penthouse's sterile ozone and granite. It felt like a confession, an involuntary announcement of his nature in a place that had none. He spent his time exploring his gilded prison. He walked the vast marble floors, his bare feet cold against the stone. He sat on the severe, uncomfortable furniture that was designed for aesthetics, not for comfort. He stared out at the city, watching the sky traffic weave silent, intricate patterns of light. He ate the flavorless but nutritionally perfect meals that dispensed from the wall synthesizer. He slept in the large, empty bed, his dreams filled with a confusing mix of fear and a strange, burgeoning security. Kalin was a phantom. Elian rarely saw him. He would hear the soft hiss of a door on the upper level, or catch a fleeting glimpse of his silver-haired silhouette passing the end of a hallway. The Alpha's scent was a constant presence, a reminder of his ownership, yet the man himself was absent. There were no demands, no commands, no interactions at all beyond a curt nod if they happened to pass each other. The lack of cruelty was its own form of torment. Elian had spent his life defined by his Omega status, first by the need to hide it, to appear neutral, to compete in a world that would dismiss him, and then, in the end, by the need to sell it. He understood the dynamics of submission and dominance, of desire and control. He did not understand this. He was an object of immense value, left to gather dust on a shelf. The silence gnawed at him. He found himself craving a command, an order, anything to break the placid, unnerving stillness of his new life, anything to define his purpose here. On the fifth day, he found the contract. He was wandering through the main living area when a section of the marble wall slid aside, revealing a small, hidden study. It was the one room that felt lived in. A large desk of dark, polished wood dominated the space, its surface holding a single data slate. Books, real books with paper pages and leather bindings, lined the shelves. The air here was different, tinged with the scent of old paper and Kalen's ozone. It felt like the heart of the Alpha's domain. And there, lying on the corner of the desk, was the original hard copy of his transfer document, the physical manifestation of his bondage. His name was printed in stark black ink beside Kalen's elegant, severe signature. His own signature was a shaky, pathetic scrawl beneath it. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the paper. It was cool and smooth, a simple object that held the entire weight of his life. He felt a surge of cold, helpless rage. This piece of paper was the reason he was here. It was the lock, the chain, the deed.
It was the source of Kalen's power over him. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the document, but eventually he heard a soft sound behind him. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Kalen stood in the doorway, his grey eyes fixed on Elian's hand, which was still resting on
the contract. He wore simple black trousers and a soft grey shirt, and without the severe tailoring of his suit, he looked younger, less like a corporate entity, and more like a man. But the power was still there, a coiled stillness in his posture. "I was not aware I had left this room unsecured," Kalen said, his voice a low, neutral hum. There was no anger in it, only a statement of fact. Elian snatched his hand back as if the paper had burned him, his face flushed with shame and defiance. "I saw it was open," he said, his voice thin. "You are permitted to explore," Kalen replied, his gaze unreadable. He walked into the study, his presence instantly making the room feel smaller. He stopped on the other side of the desk, creating a barrier between them. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Elian couldn't bear it any longer. The sight of the contract, the proof of his subjugation, had shattered his fragile composure. "Why?" he blurted out, the word raw and desperate. "Why did you buy me? You paid a fortune, and you do nothing. You leave me here in this museum. I am not an art piece. I am not a pet you forget to feed. What do you want from me?" His voice cracked on the last words, the frustration and confusion of the past 5 days pouring out of him. He was ready for anything, for anger, for dismissal, for a cruel laugh. He was not ready for the profound weariness that settled over Kalen's features, the first genuine emotion Elian had ever seen on his face. Kalen looked from Elian to the contract on the desk, and then back to Elian. His stormy eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing not just the trembling Omega before him, but the entire sordid system that had brought them to this point. "What I want," Kalen said, his voice quiet but intense, "is for this document to be meaningless." He picked up the contract. Elian flinched, expecting him to brandish it, to remind him of his place. But Kalen's gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the confines of the room. The moment hung between them, suspended and fragile, a turning point that Elian could feel, but not yet understand. Kalen held the contract in one hand, the paper a stark white rectangle against the grey of his shirt. Elian's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the recitation of terms, the final assertion of dominance. He braced himself, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his entire body a knot of defensive tension. He would not beg. He would not plead. He would hear the terms of his servitude, and he would endure them. Kalen's gaze, however, was not on him. It was fixed on the document itself, and his expression was one of cold, quiet distaste, as if he were holding something unclean. He turned and walked to a minimalist fireplace set into the far wall, a sleek, black slit that currently lay dormant. With a gesture, he activated it. A silent, blue-white flame flickered to life. A heatless, synthetic fire that consumed no fuel and produced no smoke. It was as sterile and controlled as everything else in the penthouse. Elian watched, his confusion warring with his fear. What was he doing? Was this some kind of ritual? A demonstration of power? Kalen held the contract over the synthetic flames, his silver hair catching the unnatural blue light. He did not look at Elian. He did not say a word. He simply lowered his hand. The corner of the paper touched the flame, It did not ignite with a satisfying roar, but simply began to dissolve, the edge blackening and curling into nothingness. The technology was ruthlessly efficient, unmaking the paper molecule by molecule. Elian stared, mesmerized and horrified. The fire consumed the dense legal text, the clauses of ownership, the waivers of his rights. It ate through the letterhead of the sovereign consortium. It reached the signature line. For a fraction of a second, he saw his own name, Elian Amarel, before it too turned to black ash and vanished into the clean, sterile air. Kalen held the paper until the last corner of it was gone, until his fingers were inches from the dissolving flame. Then he retracted his hand and deactivated the fire. The blue light vanished, plunging the room back into its soft, ambient glow. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The contract was gone. Utterly and completely gone. There was no ash, no smoke, no evidence it had ever existed. Elian's mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed. He had expected threats, demands, a confirmation of his status as property. He had not expected this quiet, absolute annihilation of the very instrument of his bondage. He looked at Kalen, his eyes wide with disbelief. The Alpha stood with his back to him, staring at the empty fireplace. The tension in his shoulders was palpable. What did you do?" Elian whispered, his voice trembling. Kalen turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold composure, but his storm-grey eyes were turbulent, roiling with an emotion Elian could not name. "The transaction with Silas Vaughn was a necessity to secure your brother's safety and remove a corrupt element from the board," he said, his voice flat and clinical, as if he were discussing a corporate merger. "The acquisition of you as an asset was the unfortunate, unavoidable byproduct of that transaction." He paused, his gaze meeting Elian's. "I have no interest in owning another person. The debt is paid. The contract is void. You are not property." The words struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. Not property. The debt is paid. It was everything he had sacrificed himself to achieve for his brother, a freedom he had never, ever expected for himself. The foundation of his reality for the past week, the reality of being owned, of being an asset, crumbled into dust just like the paper in the fire. He felt a wave of vertigo so intense that he swayed on his feet, his hand flying out to grip the edge of the desk for support. Freedom. The word was a terrifying, gaping void. If he was not property, then what was he? Why was he here? Then why? "Why am I still here?" he managed to ask, his throat tight. "If I am free, why can't I leave?" Kalen's impassive facade finally cracked. A look of profound, aching weariness settled on his features. Because the world that buys and sells people does not simply forget a 5 million credit transaction. To them, you are still an asset, a symbol. Releasing you now, without a plan, without protection, would be a death sentence. Vaughn has associates. My rivals would see you as a weakness to be exploited. You would be hunted. He took a step closer, his scent of ozone and granite a steady, grounding presence in Elian's spinning world. "You are free," Kalen repeated, his voice softer now, losing its clinical edge. "But you are not yet safe. I brought you here to protect you, not to own you." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. The truth of his words settled into Elian's bones, a heavy, shocking realization. This entire time, he had been a guest, not a prisoner, a refugee, not a slave. The sterile penthouse was not a cage. It was a sanctuary. The Alpha was not his master. He was his protector. The sheer, unexpected kindness of it, layered beneath so much cold formality, was too much. The walls Elian had built around his heart, the walls of pride and resolve and stoic endurance, they shattered. A sob tore its way from his chest, a raw, ragged sound of pain and relief and utter confusion. His legs gave way, and he slid to the floor, his body shaking with the force of his emotion. He was free. He was free, and he was terrified. He was no one's property, and he had never felt more lost in his entire life. Kalen moved with a sudden, fluid grace that belied his usual stillness. In 2 long strides, he was across the room, kneeling in front of Elian. He didn't touch him, not at first. He simply knelt there, his presence a shield against the overwhelming tide of Elian's emotions. The raw, unfiltered scent of the Omega's distress, fear, and relief, and a deep, aching sorrow filled the small study. It was a scent that should have triggered a possessive, dominant response in any alpha. But Kalen felt only a cold, familiar ache in his own chest. He had seen this kind of breakdown before. The shattering that comes after the immediate threat is gone, when the mind is finally forced to process the trauma it has endured. He had seen it in the mirror. He reached out slowly, his movements deliberate so as not to startle the distraught man before him. He placed a hand gently on Elian's shoulder. The Omega flinched, but didn't pull away. He was trembling violently, his head bowed, his face hidden in his hands. "Breathe," Kalen said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of Elian's breakdown. "Just breathe." He kept his hand on Elian's shoulder, a point of firm, stable contact. He could feel the tremors racking the boy's slender frame. He was so much smaller than Kalen had realized, curled in on himself on the marble floor. Not a defiant asset, not a strategic problem, just a young man who had been pushed past his breaking point. The clinical detachment Kalen had so carefully maintained began to erode, washed away by the raw, unguarded display of vulnerability. He was suddenly, acutely aware of the temperature of the room, the hardness of the floor, the inadequacy of the thin tunic Elian still wore. He had been so focused on the strategic necessities, neutralizing the threat, securing the asset, controlling the environment, that he had failed to account for the most crucial variable, the person at the center of it all. "It's over," Kalen found himself saying, the words feeling clumsy and insufficient. "The debt is gone. Your brother is safe. You are safe here." He wasn't sure if Elian could even hear him through the storm of his own sobbing. He just knew he had to say it, to make the reality of it as solid as his hand on Elian's shoulder. He looked around the sterile study, at the cold marble and the severe lines of the furniture, and saw it for the first time through Elian's eyes. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a sensory deprivation chamber, an architectural void. He had offered safety, but had provided no comfort. He had given freedom, but had offered no context for it. He had treated a traumatized man like a piece of sensitive cargo, to be stored securely until it could be safely rerouted. The thought sent a shard of self-recrimination through him. He remembered another Omega, years ago, his younger sister, Lyra. She had been bright and defiant, with a scent of lilac and summer rain. She hadn't been sold at auction, but she had been trapped by the same system, bartered in a marriage contract to seal a corporate alliance for their family's consortium. Kalen had been too young, too powerless within the family hierarchy to stop it. He had watched as her spirit was slowly crushed by a brutish, possessive alpha who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful acquisition.
a broodmare to secure his lineage. She had faded, her vibrant scent turning dull and thin, her laughter silencing until one day she simply stopped. An unfortunate accident, the official report had called it. Kalen knew it was suicide. He had sworn that day that he would amass enough power to break the system that had broken her. He would never again stand by while another person was treated as property. And yet, here he was, having done the very thing he despised. He had bought a person. He had put him in a cage, no matter how gilded. He had justified it with logic and strategy, but the result was the same. A terrified Omega, broken and weeping on his floor. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He was not his sister's husband. He would not be the monster in this story. He would be better. Slowly, carefully, Kalen moved his hand from Elian's shoulder and wrapped an arm around his back, pulling him into a tentative, supportive embrace. Elian stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against him, his sobs muffling against Kalen's shirt. Kalen held him, his movements stiff and unpracticed. He was not a man given to physical comfort, but he held on, weathering the storm of Elian's grief, offering his own steady presence as an anchor. He was no longer just a protector. He was a witness to the pain the world had inflicted, and to the fragile, terrifying dawn of a freedom Elian did not yet know how to hold. The scent of ozone and granite mingled with the scent of rain and honey, a strange and discordant harmony in the silent, sterile room. For the first time, it did not feel like the scent of an owner and his property. It felt like the scent of two solitary souls adrift in the same cold, unforgiving universe, finding a fragile, unexpected harbor in one another. The storm passed, leaving in its wake a profound, trembling exhaustion. Elian's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, his body limp against Kalen's. The initial violent shock had given way to a numb, hollowed-out disbelief. He was aware, in a distant sort of way, of the solid warmth of the alpha's chest beneath his cheek, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, the strong arm around his back. He should have been terrified, an Omega, vulnerable and scent-marked by distress in the arms of an unknown alpha. His every instinct should have been screaming at him to pull away, to hide, but his instincts were silent. There was no threat here. The alpha's scent was not predatory or possessive. It was calm, steady, a protective barrier. It felt safe. The realization was as shocking as the burning of the contract. Slowly, awkwardly, Elian pulled back. He couldn't bring himself to meet Kalen's eyes, his face hot with the shame of his breakdown. He stared at the floor, at the intricate grey veins in the white marble. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick and raw. "You have nothing to apologize for." Kalen's voice came from above him, quiet and firm. A hand appeared in his line of sight, offering to help him up. Elian hesitated for a moment before taking it. Kalen's grip was strong and warm, and he easily pulled Elian to his feet. Elian swayed, his legs still unsteady, and Kalen's hand moved to his elbow to steady him. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a strange warmth through him. "Come," Kalen said. "You should not be on the floor." He led Elian out of the study and into the main living area, steering him toward one of the long, grey sofas. He sat Elian down, then disappeared for a moment, returning with a glass of water. He pressed it into Elian's trembling hands. "Drink." Elian obeyed, the cool water a balm to his raw throat. Kalen did not sit beside him.
Instead, he stood by the vast window, his back to Elian, giving him a semblance of privacy. He stared out at the city lights, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have managed this situation poorly," Kalen said to the glass, his reflection a pale spectre against the night sky. "My methods are clinical. I am not accustomed to accounting for the emotional variable. I apologize for the distress my lack of transparency has caused you." An apology. An alpha, a sovereign, was apologizing to him. The world had truly been turned on its axis. "You saved my brother," Elian said quietly, his voice gaining a little strength. "And you freed me. I don't understand why." Kalen was silent for a long moment, the city lights reflecting in the dark glass before him. "I had a sister," he said finally, his voice low, tinged with a grief that time had clearly not erased. "Her name was Lyra. Our family, our society. It saw her as an asset to be leveraged, a beautiful piece in a game of corporate power. She was married off to a man who saw her as a prize, not a person. The system is designed to commodify, to control. It broke her." He turned from the window, his grey eyes meeting Elian's across the vast, empty room. "I will not be a part of that system. Not anymore. When I saw you in that room, I saw not an Omega for sale, but another person being fed into the gears of that same machine. Buying you was the only way I could pull you out." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and deeply personal. It explained everything. The coldness, the distance, the burning of the contract. It was not about him. It was about Lyra. He was an act of penance, a rebellion against a ghost. Elian felt a pang of something complex, empathy for the Alpha's loss, and a strange, hollow feeling of being a proxy for a dead girl. But beneath that was a burgeoning sense of gratitude. Kalen's motives were his own, born of his own tragedy. But the result was Elian's freedom. "I am not your sister," Elian said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Kalen gave a slow, somber nod. "I know," he said, "and you are not my responsibility in the same way. You are a free man, Elian. My only role now is to ensure you can live that freedom safely." A new kind of silence settled between them, different from the tense, uncertain silence of before. This one was contemplative, fragile. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shattered. They were no longer owner and property. They were two strangers, bound by a strange transaction, trying to navigate the unexpected aftermath. The penthouse no longer felt like a cage, but it did not yet feel like a home. It was a neutral space, a waiting room between one life and the next. "What happens now?" Elian asked, the question encompassing everything. Kalen walked over and finally sat down, not on the same sofa, but in a chrome armchair opposite him, maintaining a respectful distance. "Now, you recover," he said. "You rest, you eat, you allow your body and your mind to heal from what you've been through. When you are ready, we will discuss your options. A new identity, a relocation, financial support to start a new life far from this city, and anyone who knows your face. The choice will be yours." He laid out the future like a strategic plan, but his tone was different now. It was not the coldness of a CEO, but the careful consideration of a guardian, a protector. Elian looked at this powerful, solitary man, a man who moved mountains of wealth and influence, all driven by a quiet, fierce grief. He had bought Elian to save his own soul, and in doing so, he had saved Elian's life. The debt was gone, but a new, unspoken connection had been forged in the fire that had consumed the contract. It was not a bond of ownership, but something far more complex and perhaps far more binding. In the week that followed, the atmosphere in the penthouse underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The sterile chill began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative warmth. The change began with scent. No longer trying to suppress or hide it, Elian's natural fragrance of rain and honey filled the space, a soft, organic presence that seemed to round the sharp edges of the minimalist decor. Kalen, in turn, seemed to consciously gentle the sharp, authoritative edge of his own ozone and granite scent, letting it settle into a calmer, more grounding presence. The air between them, once fraught with tension and silence, now carried a quiet, unspoken dialogue. Kalen began to emerge from his self-imposed isolation. He started taking his meals not in his private quarters, but in the main dining area, an absurdly long table of polished obsidian. He would sit at one end, Elian at the other, the distance between them vast. But it was a shared space, a shared silence. They would eat the synthesized meals, and sometimes Kalen would speak. He did not ask about Elian's past, or his feelings, or his trauma. He spoke of neutral things, the architectural history of the spire, the migratory patterns of the cyber flocks that swarmed the upper atmosphere, the complex political dance of the corporate consortiums. He spoke as if lecturing a student, his tone dry and academic, but Elian understood it for what it was, an offering, an attempt to fill the silence with something other than their shared history of pain and transaction. Elian, in turn, began to emerge from his own shell. He started to speak, his voice quiet at first, then gaining confidence. He asked questions about the books in Kalen's study. He learned that the Alpha had a passion for pre-digital history, for the tangible, flawed reality of a world before everything was streamlined and sterile. He discovered that Kalen's controlled stillness was a discipline, a lifetime of training to mask a fiercely intelligent and surprisingly restless mind. They were two ghosts learning to see each other. Elian found himself no longer feeling like a specimen in a museum. The penthouse was starting to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a home, a strange, silent, sky-high home with only one other occupant, but a home nonetheless. He had a room, he had safety, and he had the quiet, unwavering presence of the man who had given it to him. One evening, Elian was on the outdoor terrace, a narrow strip of rock garden and recycled air that clung to the side of the spire. The wind was a cold, clean thing up here, and the city below was a silent, glittering jewel. He was tending to the single, resilient moss garden, his fingers tracing the soft green patterns, when Kalen joined him. He didn't speak, simply stood beside Elian, looking out at the horizon. "When I was a boy," Elian said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "My brother and I lived in the lower sectors. We had a small hydro garden on our window ledge. Reese was always trying to engineer new, more vibrant phosphorescent fungi. He cared more about making things glow than making them edible." A small smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile Kalen had ever seen on his face. It transformed his features, chasing away the shadows of fear and sorrow. "He sounds brilliant, but impractical," Kalen observed, his voice a low rumble. "He is," Elian agreed. "He sees the world in terms of potential, of beauty. He doesn't see the dangers. I was always the one who had to see them for him." He looked at Kalen, his gaze direct. "Thank you for saving him from a danger he never would have seen coming." Kalen's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. Men like Silas Vaughan thrive on the dreams of men like your brother. It was no trouble. The moment was interrupted by a soft chime from inside the penthouse. It was Kaelin's private comms line. Kaelin's face hardened instantly, the brief moment of warmth vanishing, replaced by his usual mask of cool control. "Excuse me," he said, before turning and striding back inside. Elian stayed on the terrace, a sudden, cold premonition creeping over him. The peace they had built felt fragile, a thin pane of glass, and he feared that chime was the sound of a stone being thrown against it. A few minutes later, Kaelin returned. His face was grim, his scent sharp with a controlled, cold anger. "There is a complication," he said, his voice clipped. "Silas Vaughan. It seems he does not consider our transaction concluded." Elian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? You paid him. The debt is gone." "The monetary debt is gone," Kaelin corrected, his grey eyes like chips of ice. "But Vaughan is a man who deals in flesh and leverage. He believes I stole his property. He is not a man who lets go of a perceived asset, especially one he now knows is valued at 5 million credits." He looked at Elian, and the protective instinct in his gaze was fierce. "He has made inquiries about your brother. Not direct threats, but feelers. He is testing my defenses, trying to re-establish his leverage." The fragile peace of the last week shattered. The fear Elian thought he had left behind came rushing back, cold and suffocating. Vaughan wasn't just a memory. He was an active threat, and he was targeting Rhys again. "No," Elian whispered, shaking his head. "He can't. Rhys has to be safe." "He is safe, for now," Kaelin assured him, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Vaughan is an insect, but a persistent one. I underestimated his audacity. I will deal with this." The way he said it sent a shiver down Elian's spine. It was not a promise of negotiation. It was a promise of eradication. Kaelin's entire demeanor had shifted. The quiet, academic man was gone, replaced by the sovereign, the ruthless corporate predator who had stunned an auction house into silence. He was turning the full force of his power, a power Elian could barely comprehend, onto the man who had first bought and sold him. "What are you going to do?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kaelin's gaze was fixed on the city below, as if he could see Vaughan crawling through the neon-lit canyons. "I am going to remind him," Kaelin said, his voice soft and utterly chilling, "what happens when you try to take something that belongs to me." The possessive pronoun hung in the air, a stark, unintentional confession. He had freed Elian from ownership, but in his mind, in his protective fury, Elian was still his to protect, his to defend. The ghost of the contract had returned, not as a chain, but as a shield. The penthouse, once a silent sanctuary, became the command center for a silent war. Kaelin retreated into his study, the doors sliding shut, sealing him away with his data slates and encrypted communication lines. Elian was left to wander the silent marble spaces, the air thick with the Alpha's cold, focused fury. The scent of ozone was sharp now, a constant, low-level hum of gathering power. Elian felt like he was living in the calm eye of a hurricane. He knew Kaelin was fighting for him, for Rhys, but the silence and the waiting were a unique form of torture. He found himself hovering near the study, listening for any sound, any indication of what was happening in the world beyond their glass tower. He saw the strain in Kaelin when he occasionally emerged for nutrient paste or water. There were new, fine lines around his eyes. His movements were tight, controlled, radiating a lethal energy. He was hunting. On the third day of this silent siege, Elian couldn't bear it any longer. He approached the study and, after a moment's hesitation, pressed the panel to open the door. It slid aside to reveal Kalen standing before a holographic display, a shimmering web of data points, financial records, and surveillance feeds. He was a general surveying a battlefield. He didn't turn as Elian entered, but he spoke, his voice tight. "This is not your concern, Elian. You are safe here." "He is threatening my brother," Elian said, his voice shaking but firm. "That makes it my concern. Let me help." Kalen finally turned, a faint, humorless smile on his lips. "And what would you do? Confront him? He would have you back in chains within the hour." The words were harsh, but not cruel. They were a statement of fact. "I am not as helpless as you think," Elian countered, stung by the dismissal. "I survived on my own for years. I protected Reese." "You protected him by selling yourself," Kalen said, his voice softening slightly. "An act of incredible courage and profound desperation. That is a sacrifice you will not have to make again." He gestured to the holographic map. "This is my battlefield, Elian. My weapons are financial algorithms, legal loopholes, and systemic pressure. Vaughn thinks he is a predator. I'm going to show him he is merely prey for a much larger animal." His confidence was absolute, but Elian could see the cost. This was not easy, even for a man like Kalen. Vaughn was entrenched, a parasite with connections woven through the city's underbelly. "Let me do something," Elian insisted. "I feel useless, just waiting." Kalen studied him for a long moment, his grey eyes assessing. Finally, he nodded slowly. He pointed to a stream of data scrolling on the display. "Vaughn uses a network of shell corporations to launder his funds. They are designed to look legitimate. My algorithms can flag financial anomalies, but they can't always interpret human intent. Your brother's research was in predictive social modeling, was it not?" Elian nodded, surprised he knew that. "Look at these," Kalen said, isolating 3 corporate entities. "They seem clean, but they are based in a sector known for creative accounting. Tell me what someone from the lower sectors, someone desperate, would see in their public charters. Would they look like a lifeline or a trap?" He was giving Elian a task, a small one, but a real one. He was asking for his perspective, his knowledge. He was treating him as a partner. Elian stepped closer to the shimmering data, his fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of purpose. He studied the charters, the loan terms, the promissory notes. He saw the familiar, predatory language hidden beneath layers of legal jargon. "It's a trap," he said, pointing to one. "This one offers debt consolidation, but the interest rate is variable, tied to a market index that is notoriously volatile. They would be offering a drowning man an anchor disguised as a life raft." Kalen's eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory light. "Precisely," he murmured. "The human element." For the next few hours, they worked together. Elian provided the context, the ground-level understanding of desperation that Kalen's high-level data could not. He pointed out the shell companies that mimicked legitimate charities, the loan schemes that targeted students. He was a guide in the dark, twisted alleys of the world Kalen sought to control. And Kalen listened. He absorbed the information, his fingers flying across the console, redirecting his financial attacks with a new surgical precision. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was no longer a silent command center. It was a collaboration. They stood side by side, their scents mingling, a strange and potent combination of power and insight. And then it happened. A priority alert flashed across the screen, an incoming communication, unencrypted, from Silas Vaughn. "He's making his move," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He accepted the call. A life-sized hologram of Silas Vaughn flickered to life in the center of the room. He was a coarse, brutish man, with a cruel smile and eyes that were small and cunning. He was lounging in a garish, opulent office, a stark contrast to Kalen's sterile domain. "Rael," Vaughn sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I was beginning to think you were going to hide behind your firewalls forever. I've been trying to reach you." "I have been occupied," Kalen replied, his voice a blade of ice. Vaughn's eyes flickered to the side, and Elian realized with a jolt of terror that he could see him standing beside Kalen. Vaughn's smile widened, a predator's grin. "Ah, there he is, the 5 million credit Omega. You look well kept. I do hope you appreciate the high-class cage your new master has provided." "Elian is not your concern," Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. "Oh, but he is," Vaughn countered. "You see, we had a deal. I procure assets. People like you buy them. You broke the rules. You didn't just buy my asset. You tried to erase my business. My associates are unhappy. My finances are disrupted." "A temporary inconvenience, I assure you," Kalen said smoothly. "Soon you will have nothing left to be inconvenienced by." Vaughn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Big words from a man in a tower. But your tower has cracks. I have a message for you, from a mutual acquaintance, your little Omega's brother. He's become quite the careless walker. It would be a shame if he had an accident in the lower transit levels." The threat was naked, brutal. Elian felt the blood drain from his face. He took an involuntary step forward, a choked sound escaping his lips. Kalen put a hand on his arm, a firm, restraining touch. "You will not touch him," Kalen said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. All pretense of civility was gone. This was the sovereign in his full, terrifying power. "I can be at your office in 20 minutes, Kalen continued, his voice a silken promise of violence. "We can conclude this discussion in person." Vaughn's bravado wavered for a fraction of a second. The idea of Kalen Rael leaving his tower, of bringing his fight to Vaughn's doorstep, was clearly not what he had expected. But he recovered quickly. "No need for that," he sneered. "Let's be civilized. I want compensation, and I want the Omega back. He's a valuable commodity." "That is not going to happen," Kalen stated. "Then I guess the brother will just have to pay the price for your arrogance," Vaughn spat. Elian's control broke. "Leave him alone," he shouted, his voice high with panic. Vaughn's eyes gleamed with triumph. He had found the weak spot. He had made Elian react. But Kalen was preternaturally calm. He looked at Vaughn with an expression of mild pity. "You have made a grave miscalculation, Silas," he said softly. He tapped a command into his console. On the display behind Vaughn's hologram, a flurry of alerts began to appear. Account seizures, asset freezes, legal injunctions. Vaughn's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched his empire crumble in real time. What is this?" he stammered. "This," Kalen said, his voice a cold, final judgment, "is the consequence of threatening what is mine." He made one final data entry. A new file appeared on the screen, a direct, anonymous tip to the sector marshals, detailing every one of Vaughn's illegal operations, complete with untraceable evidence. "You are a relic, Vaughn," Kalen said, as the man's face contorted in rage and panic. A brute in an age of precision. You are finished. He cut the connection. Vaughn's hologram vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of the penthouse. The war was over. It had been won not with a shout, but with a whisper. Kalen stood in the silence, his chest rising and falling slowly. The storm had passed. He turned to Elian, his grey eyes searching his face. "It is done," he said. "He will never trouble you or your brother again." Elian could only stare at him, at the man who wielded power like a scalpel, who had just dismantled a man's life to protect his. He was safe, he was free, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he never wanted to leave this tower. He never wanted to leave Kalen's side. The silence that descended upon the penthouse in the wake of Vaughn's digital execution was profound. It was not the empty, sterile silence of Elian's first days there, nor the tense, waiting silence of the past week. It was a silence of finality, of peace. The external threat had been neutralized, not just defeated, but erased from the board with chilling precision. Elian watched as Kalen systematically closed the holographic windows, collapsing the vast web of data until only the calm, ambient light of the study remained. The Alpha moved with a weary grace, the immense tension of the past few days slowly draining from his shoulders. The sharp, electric edge of his scent softened, returning to the familiar, grounding aroma of calm stone and distant rain. He had unleashed a hurricane, and now stood in the quiet aftermath, seemingly unaffected. But Elian could see the faint tremor in his hands as he powered down the main console. The battle had taken its toll, even on him. "Is he truly safe now?" Elian asked, the question a fragile whisper in the quiet room. Kalen turned to him, his expression softening as his gaze met Elian's. "I have dispatched a security detail, discreetly. They will ensure his protection until all of Vaughn's associates have been apprehended. But the primary threat is gone. Vaughn's network was built on fear and illicit credit. Without his capital, his cronies will scatter. He has no power anymore." He walked over to the small bar, tucked into a corner of the study, and poured 2 glasses of water, his movements economical and precise. He handed one to Elian. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of warmth through Elian's system. It was strange how such a small, simple gesture could feel so intimate in the wake of such immense, impersonal power. "You helped," Kalen said, leaning against the edge of his desk. "Your insight into his methods allowed me to sever his financial roots much more cleanly. Thank you." He was giving him credit. He was acknowledging his contribution. In that moment, Elian felt more like a partner than he ever had in his life. He was not a protected asset. He was an ally. "I should be thanking you," Elian replied, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was gratitude, yes, but it was deeper than that. It was awe. It was a profound, soul-deep sense of security. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just kept me, hidden me away. But you went to war for my brother. For me." Kalen looked down into his glass, swirling the water. "I told you," he said quietly, not meeting Elian's eyes. "I will not be a part of the system that commodifies people. Freeing you was not enough. I had to ensure the man who put you on that block could never do it to anyone else." It was always about the principle, the ghost of his sister, Lyra. But as Kalen finally looked up, his stormy eyes locking with Elian's, Elian saw something else there, something new. It was not just the memory of his sister driving him anymore. It was the presence of the man standing before him. The abstract principle had become a tangible person. "The future," Kalen said, changing the subject, his voice regaining some of its formal tone, as if he were uncomfortable with the depth of the emotion in the room. "We need to discuss your future. The offer still stands: a new identity, relocation, funds to establish a new life for you and your brother, anywhere you choose." He was offering him the world, the ultimate freedom, everything he had ever dreamed of. A life where no one knew he was an Omega, where he and Reese could be safe and anonymous. And as he heard the words, as he pictured that life, a quiet existence in some distant city, free from fear and obligation, he felt an unexpected, powerful pang of loss. He looked around the sterile, beautiful room, at the view of the glittering city from the spire, at the quiet, powerful man who had become his unlikely protector. The cage had become a sanctuary, and the sanctuary was starting to feel like home. The thought of leaving it, of leaving Kalen, was a physical ache in his chest. "I don't want to go," Elian said, the words coming out before he had even consciously formed them. The confession hung in the air, simple and absolute. Kalen froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He stared at Elian, his carefully constructed composure faltering. You don't?" he asked, a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. "You are free, Elian. You don't have to stay here. You don't owe me anything." "I know," Elian said, taking a step closer. His heart was hammering, but his voice was steady. He had spent his whole life running, hiding, sacrificing. For the first time, he was going to choose something for himself. "I know I don't owe you. I know I am free to go. But this is the first place I have ever felt safe, truly safe." He looked at Kalen, his gaze unwavering. "My whole life has been about protecting my brother, about hiding what I am. Here with you, I haven't had to do either. You protect us both. And you see me. Not as an Omega, not as an asset, but as me." Kalen was silent, his grey eyes searching Elian's face, trying to decipher the truth of his words. The Alpha's scent was in turmoil, a swirl of ozone and something else, something Elian had never smelled from him before, a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "I am not an easy man to be around, Elian," Kalen said, his voice low. "My life is this," he gestured around the empty, opulent room. "Order, control, solitude. I do not know how to share it." "You shared it with me tonight," Elian countered softly. "You let me help you. We were a team." The word hung between them, full of unspoken potential. A team. Partners. Kalen set his glass down on the desk with a soft click. He closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. The proximity was electric. Elian could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the flecks of silver in his stormy eyes. The Alpha's scent enveloped him, no longer just a protective shield, but an invitation. To stay here. It would not be a simple thing, Kalen said, his voice a rough whisper. The world would not understand. They would still see you as my property, a possession. Let them, Elian replied, his voice fierce with a newfound strength. I would know the truth. You would know the truth. Isn't that enough? Kalen reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped Elian's cheek. His thumb stroked softly against his skin. The touch was electric, a silent confirmation of everything that had passed between them. It was not the touch of an owner or even a protector. It was the touch of an equal, a tentative, questioning exploration. "Is it enough for you, Elian?" Kalen asked, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer conceal. "To stay here, with me, in this quiet, empty life?" Elian leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering shut for a moment. The scent of rain and honey from his own skin mingled with the ozone and granite of the alphas. It was a perfect, harmonious chord. "It's not empty anymore," he whispered. He opened his eyes and looked up at the powerful, solitary man who had bought his freedom only to offer him his heart. The choice was clear. The future was not in some distant, anonymous city. It was here, in the sky, in the silence, with him. The debt was long paid, the contract was ash, but a new bond had been forged in its place. A bond of trust, of respect, and of a quiet, burgeoning hope. It was a bond freely chosen, and it was stronger than any chain.